There's a peculiar sensation that comes over those who've learned to watch their own minds at work, a kind of quiet displacement, as if you're standing just slightly outside the stream of your own life. You're there, certainly, participating in conversations, moving through your days, inhabiting your body, and yet there's this persistent feeling of being somehow adjacent to it all, observing from a place that doesn't quite belong to the scene unfolding before you. It's not depression, exactly, though it can wear that mask. It's not alienation in the conventional sense, though alienation comes close to describing its texture. It's something more fundamental, more ontological, a strange awakening to the fact that the person everyone else sees when they look at you, the person who answers to your name and fulfills your social roles, is somehow not quite the real you, if there even is such a thing. And this realization, once it arrives, doesn't leave. It becomes a permanent companion, a shadow self that reminds you, always, that you are watching the watcher, thinking about the thinker, conscious of consciousness itself, in a way that creates an infinite regress of awareness folding back upon itself. Now, the peculiar thing about this condition, and we must be careful with that word, for it's not an illness or a deficiency, but perhaps something closer to an evolutionary mutation of attention, is that it seems to afflict precisely those individuals who've taken the life of the mind seriously, who've wandered too far down the garden paths of introspection and philosophical inquiry. These are the people who, somewhere along the way, made the fatal mistake of asking, "Who am I?" with genuine curiosity rather than as a rhetorical flourish. They're the ones who couldn't help but notice that the narrative of their identity, the story they tell themselves about themselves, is just that, a story, constructed from fragments of memory, edited by the needs of the present moment, projected into an imagined future that may never arrive. And once you've seen through the narrative, once you've glimpsed the arbitrary nature of the self-concept, you can't quite unsee it. You're left in this curious position of having to continue playing the character while knowing, with absolute certainty, that the character is a fiction, a useful fiction perhaps, but a fiction nonetheless. The deep thinker, then, becomes a kind of actor who's forgotten how to lose themselves in the role. Watch a child at play, completely absorbed in their imaginary world, and you're witnessing the opposite of this condition. The child is the pirate, is the princess, is the explorer, without any remainder of self-awareness to create distance between the player and the played. But the thinker has eaten from the tree of knowledge, has tasted the fruit of self-reflection, and can never return to that garden of unself-conscious participation. They're always aware, on some level, that they're playing a role, that the performance of identity is precisely that, a performance. And this awareness creates a kind of metaphysical homesickness, a longing for a wholeness that seems to exist always in the past, or always just beyond reach, but never here, never now, never in the present moment that's actually being lived. What's fascinating, and perhaps what's most maddening about this state of affairs, is that the very faculty that creates this sense of outsiderness, this capacity for meta-awareness, this ability to think about thinking, is also the faculty that our culture celebrates as the highest achievement of human consciousness. We're told to be rational, to examine our assumptions, to question everything, to think critically, to analyze, to dissect, to understand. And so the deep thinker does exactly that, applies these tools not just to external problems, but to the internal landscape of their own experience, and discovers that the self they thought was solid is actually a shimmering process, a verb masquerading as a noun, a river that can never be stepped into twice. They discover that the boundary between subject and object, between the experiencer and the experienced, is far more porous and provisional than they'd been led to believe. They discover that consciousness itself is this vast, open, luminous space in which all experience arises and passes away, and that the personal self, the ego, is just one more arising within that space, no more substantial than a cloud formation or a wave on the ocean. And yet, and here's where the existential vertigo really sets in, they still have to go to work in the morning. They still have to pay their bills, maintain their relationships, remember to buy groceries, respond to emails, fulfill their obligations. They still have to navigate a social world that operates on the assumption that everyone is a discrete, autonomous individual with a fixed identity and clear boundaries. They still have to participate in conversations where people speak confidently about myself and my life, as if these were self-evident, unproblematic categories. And so they find themselves in this bizarre double bind, this cognitive dissonance between their insight into the fluid, constructed, interdependent nature of identity and the practical necessity of pretending that the construction is real, that the boundaries are solid, that the self is something you can possess and control and improve. This is not, it must be said, a comfortable position to occupy. It's the position of the immigrant who never quite feels at home in either their country of origin or their adopted land. It's the position of the bilingual person who thinks in one language and speaks in another, always aware of the gap between inner experience and outer expression. It's the position of the person who's seen behind the curtain, who knows that the Wizard of Oz is just a frightened man pulling levers, but who must still interact with all the other citizens of Emerald City as if the wizard's power were absolute and unquestionable. And the exhaustion of maintaining this dual awareness, of constantly translating between the realm of insight and the realm of convention, of navigating the gap between what you've understood about the nature of reality and what you're required to pretend for social purposes. This exhaustion accumulates over time like sediment in a riverbed, creating a kind of existential fatigue that has no remedy in any conventional sense. The deep thinker often tries, at various points, to escape this predicament. Sometimes they retreat into pure intellectualism, living almost entirely in the realm of ideas, using concepts and theories as a kind of insulation against the rawness of immediate experience. Sometimes they go the opposite direction, trying to bypass thought altogether through various practices of meditation or mindfulness, attempting to cultivate a state of pure presence that precedes the arising of self-consciousness. Sometimes they seek out others like themselves, forming communities of fellow outsiders who can speak the language of existential displacement, who understand implicitly what it's like to feel like a stranger in your own skin. And sometimes, perhaps most commonly, they simply learn to code switch, to toggle between different modes of being depending on the context, becoming adept shapeshifters who can pass as normal when necessary, while maintaining their inner apartness as a kind of secret identity. But none of these strategies quite resolves the fundamental paradox, which is that the very consciousness that allows you to step back and observe your experience is itself part of the experience you're observing. You can't get outside of consciousness to look at consciousness, any more than an eye can see itself directly. You can see the reflection of the eye in a mirror, but that's not the same as the eye seeing itself. And so the deep thinker is caught in this hall of mirrors, this infinite regress of awareness aware of awareness. And the more they try to locate the observer, the source of this sense of being apart from life, the more it recedes, revealing itself to be not a thing, but a process, not a location, but a movement, not a solid foundation, but a fluid dance of attention constantly recreating itself in each moment. What begins to happen, for many deep thinkers, is a gradual recognition that this sense of outsiderness might not be a problem to be solved, but a lens through which a different kind of understanding becomes possible. They begin to see that the feeling of being apart from their own life is, paradoxically, a doorway into a more intimate relationship with life itself. When you're not completely identified with your thoughts, when you've created some space between awareness and the contents of awareness, you can actually engage with experience more fully, more presently, more compassionately. You're not so caught up in defending and maintaining a particular self-image. You're not so reactive to every challenge to your identity. You're not so desperately grasping at pleasure or pushing away pain, because you've seen that both pleasure and pain arise within a larger space of consciousness that isn't damaged or enhanced by either one. This understanding doesn't make the feeling of outsiderness disappear. If anything, it becomes more pronounced, more refined, more continuously present. But its quality changes. Instead of feeling like an affliction or an isolation, it begins to feel more like a kind of freedom, a spaciousness, a liberation from the tyranny of having to be someone in particular. You still play your roles, still fulfill your functions, still move through the social world with all its demands and expectations. But you're doing it lightly, playfully, with a kind of cosmic humor about the whole production. You're in the world, but not of it, as the old spiritual saying goes, participating fully, while knowing that the participation is a kind of divine play, a game that consciousness is playing with itself for no particular reason other than the sheer joy of the game. The difficulty, of course, is that this understanding, this recognition that your outsiderness is actually a form of seeing, a kind of clear perception uncluttered by the usual defensive mechanisms of ego, doesn't protect you from the very real social consequences of being different. Because make no mistake, the deep thinker is different, not in some superior or elevated sense, but different in the way that anyone who operates from a fundamentally different set of assumptions about reality is going to be different from the mainstream. And other people sense this difference, even if they can't quite articulate what it is they're sensing. There's something about the person who's always slightly watching, always maintaining that observer position, that makes others uncomfortable. It's as if, on some unconscious level, people can tell that you're not fully buying into the consensus reality, that you're holding something back, that you're not as invested in the collective dream as everyone else seems to be. This creates a peculiar dynamic in relationships, particularly intimate relationships, where the expectation is that you'll lower your defenses, merge your identity with another person, lose yourself in the connection. The deep thinker can love, certainly, can care deeply, can commit and connect and create intimacy, but there's always this part of them that remains slightly apart, observing even the most tender moments with that same meta-awareness that observes everything else. And this can feel, to a partner who doesn't share this tendency, like a kind of withholding, a refusal to fully surrender to the relationship. They might say things like, "You're always in your head," or "I never feel like I fully have your attention," or "It's like you're analyzing us even when we're just supposed to be together." And they're not wrong exactly. The deep thinker is analyzing, is observing, is maintaining that witness consciousness, even in moments of connection. Not because they're cold or distant or unloving, but because that witness consciousness is now a permanent feature of their perceptual apparatus. It's like asking someone who's learned to see color to go back to seeing in black and white. The capacity, once developed, doesn't just shut off when it becomes inconvenient. The same pattern repeats in professional life, where the deep thinker often struggles to find work that doesn't feel like a betrayal of their understanding. Most jobs, most careers, most organizational structures are predicated on the assumption that people are discrete units of productivity, that time can be commodified, that meaning can be found in achievement and accumulation, that identity is something to be branded and marketed. And the deep thinker, having seen through these assumptions, finds it increasingly difficult to participate in these structures with genuine enthusiasm. They do the work, yes, they show up, they perform their functions, but there's a kind of psychic cost to spending 8 or 10 or 12 hours a day pretending to care about things you know, in your bones, are ultimately arbitrary and inconsequential. This isn't cynicism exactly. Cynicism would require a kind of emotional investment, a sense of betrayal or disappointment. It's more like a profound acceptance of absurdity, a recognition that the entire game is made up, that we're all just playing along with conventions that have no ultimate foundation in reality, and that the emperor really is naked, even though everyone's agreed to pretend otherwise. What happens over time is that the deep thinker develops a kind of dual consciousness, an ability to function in the conventional world while simultaneously seeing through its conventional nature. They become fluent in the language of the everyday, skilled at code switching between different registers of reality. They can talk about career goals and 5-year plans and personal branding while knowing, in some deeper register of awareness, that all of this is a kind of elaborate fiction we've collectively agreed to take seriously. They can participate in social rituals, the dinner parties, the networking events, the casual conversations about weather and sports and celebrity gossip, while maintaining an inner distance from these rituals, observing them with the same curious attention an anthropologist might bring to studying a foreign culture. This dual consciousness is exhausting, certainly, but it's also oddly liberating. Once you've accepted that you're never going to fully belong, that you're always going to be somewhat apart from whatever context you're in, you can relax into that apartness, can stop trying so hard to fit in, can allow yourself to be the outsider you actually are. But here's where things get really interesting, where the paradox deepens and becomes more subtle. Because what the deep thinker eventually discovers, if they keep following the thread of their inquiry, is that this sense of being an outsider is itself a construct, another story that consciousness is telling itself. The witness, the observer, the part of you that feels separate from experience, that's also arising in consciousness. That's also part of the stream of experience you thought you were standing outside of. You're not actually separate from your life. You're not actually observing from some privileged position outside the system. That's an illusion created by the particular way your attention is organized, by the habit of reflexive self-awareness that's become so ingrained you've mistaken it for your fundamental nature. The real insight, the deeper understanding, is that there is no separate observer. There's just observing, just experiencing, just this seamless flow of consciousness expressing itself in infinite forms. And what you call you is simply one of those forms, no more separate from the whole than a wave is separate from the ocean. This realization doesn't come all at once, and it doesn't come permanently. It's more like a glimpse, a momentary opening, a brief suspension of the usual subject-object duality that structures ordinary consciousness. And when it happens, when you get even a taste of this non-dual awareness, it completely recontextualizes the experience of outsiderness. You realize that the reason you've always felt like a stranger in your own life is not because you're somehow fundamentally different or separate or special, but because you've been looking at the whole thing from the wrong angle. You've been asking, who am I in relation to this life I'm living? When the real question is, what is this I that seems to be separate from life? And when you really investigate that question, when you really look for the supposed entity that's living your life, you can't find it. You find thoughts, certainly, and sensations, and emotions, and perceptions, and memories. But you don't find a thinker behind the thoughts, a feeler behind the feelings, an experiencer behind the experience. There's just the experience itself, arising spontaneously, effortlessly, without any need for a separate self to author or control or own it. This is, of course, the central insight of most contemplative traditions, expressed in different languages across different cultures. The Buddhists call it anatta, no self, the recognition that what we call the self is actually a collection of processes with no fixed essence. The Hindus speak of Atman and Brahman, the individual soul and the universal soul, being one and the same, not two separate things, but two ways of viewing the same reality. The Taoists talk about Wu Wei, effortless action, the spontaneous harmony that emerges when you stop trying to impose your will on the flow of life and instead allow yourself to be moved by that flow. And the Zen masters hit you with their koans and their paradoxes, trying to short-circuit the conceptual mind and create an opening for direct perception of your true nature. The language varies, the methods differ, but they're all pointing toward the same fundamental recognition, that the separate self you think you are is a fiction, and that the reality of your being is something far more vast, far more mysterious, far more intimately connected with all of existence than the isolated ego could ever imagine. But here's the trick, the thing that makes this understanding so difficult to stabilize and integrate. Even after you've had this glimpse of non-dual awareness, even after you've seen through the illusion of separation, you still have to come back to ordinary consciousness, still have to navigate the relative world of subjects and objects, still have to maintain the conventional boundaries between self and other that make practical life possible. You can't stay in the absolute perspective all the time. You'd walk into traffic, you'd forget to eat, you'd lose your capacity to function in the social world. And so you're left with this peculiar challenge of holding both perspectives simultaneously, of knowing that ultimately there is no separate self, while still having to operate as if there were a separate self in your day-to-day life. This is what the Zen tradition calls, after the ecstasy, the laundry, the recognition that enlightenment or awakening or whatever you want to call it doesn't exempt you from the ordinary demands of human existence, doesn't make you superhuman or beyond the need for food and shelter and connection. It just changes your relationship to those demands, infuses them with a different quality of awareness, allows you to engage with the practical necessities of life without being so completely identified with them. So the deep thinker, who's had this glimpse of non-dual awareness, finds themselves in an even stranger position than before. Now they're not just outsiders to conventional social reality. They're outsiders to their own sense of outsiderness. They've seen that the observer they thought they were is itself observed, that the witness is itself witnessed, that consciousness has no center and no periphery, but is simply this open, spacious awareness in which all experience arises and passes away. And yet they still feel, on a visceral level, like a separate person moving through a world of separate things. The existential vertigo deepens. The sense of displacement becomes more subtle, more refined, more difficult to articulate. How do you explain to someone that you don't actually exist in the way you appear to exist, that you're simultaneously nobody and everybody, that your individual life is both completely real and completely illusory depending on which level of analysis you're operating from? The answer, of course, is that you mostly don't explain it. You learn to live with the paradox, to embody the contradiction, to be simultaneously wave and ocean, form and emptiness, relative and absolute. You learn to speak different languages to different audiences, to meet people where they are without demanding that they follow you into the territories of consciousness you've explored. You learn that wisdom is not about having all the answers, but about being comfortable with the questions, about resting in the not knowing, about allowing mystery to remain mysterious without constantly trying to resolve it into some conceptual framework that the mind can grasp and control. You learn that being an outsider is not a problem to be solved, but a position to be inhabited, a perspective to be honored, a gift that allows you to see what others cannot see, precisely because you're not fully captured by the consensus trance. And so we arrive at a deeper layer of understanding, a recognition that the deep thinker's sense of outsiderness is not just a psychological condition or a philosophical insight, but a kind of evolutionary edge, a place where consciousness is testing its own boundaries, exploring its own possibilities, discovering what lies beyond the familiar territories of conventional identity. Think of it this way. Every system, every structure, every organism needs a boundary to define itself, to differentiate itself from its environment. But the boundary is also where exchange happens, where the inside meets the outside, where transformation becomes possible. And the deep thinker is living at that boundary, occupying that liminal space between the known and the unknown, the mapped and the unmapped, the self and the not self. They're boundary dwellers, threshold crossers, amphibious creatures who can breathe in the air of conventional reality and also in the waters of something more fluid, more fundamental, more free. This position at the edge is uncomfortable, certainly, but it's also where creativity happens, where innovation emerges, where new possibilities are born. When you're fully inside a system, fully identified with a particular way of seeing and being, you can't see the system's limitations, can't imagine alternatives, can't question the assumptions that structure your experience. But when you're at the edge, when you have one foot in the system and one foot outside it, you can see both the necessity of structure and the arbitrariness of any particular structure. You can appreciate the way that language shapes thought, while also recognizing that reality precedes and exceeds language. You can value the social bonds that give meaning and purpose to human life, while also seeing that the self these bonds connect to is ultimately empty, a convenient fiction rather than a solid fact. This double vision, this capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapsing into any single perspective, is what gives the deep thinker their particular kind of insight, their particular kind of wisdom. But it's also what makes them difficult to categorize, difficult to pin down, difficult to use for any particular agenda or ideology. The deep thinker tends to make people nervous precisely because they can't be easily recruited into any camp, can't be counted on to toe any party line, can't be relied upon to maintain any fixed position. They're always questioning, always probing, always looking for what's being left out of the official narrative, what's being suppressed or ignored or swept under the rug. This doesn't mean they're contrarians or rebels in any conventional sense. They're not opposed to authority or tradition or convention as such. They're just unable to accept anything uncritically, unable to stop asking, but is that really true? Or, but what about this other way of looking at it? And this relentless questioning, this refusal to settle into any comfortable certainty, makes them poor candidates for membership in any tribe or movement or belief system that requires loyalty and solidarity and unquestioning allegiance. The result is a kind of chronic homelessness, a perpetual sense of not quite fitting in anywhere. The deep thinker can't fully join the materialists because they've had experiences that can't be reduced to physical processes, intimations of something transcendent or numinous or sacred that scientific materialism can't account for. But they also can't fully join the spiritualists or the religious believers because they're too skeptical, too intellectually honest, too aware of the ways that spiritual communities can become just as dogmatic and rigid and psychologically unhealthy as any secular institution. They can't join the optimists because they've seen too much suffering, too much absurdity, too much evidence that the universe doesn't care about human happiness or justice or meaning. But they can't join the pessimists or the nihilists either because they've also seen beauty, also experienced love, also felt the mysterious way that existence keeps generating new forms, new possibilities, new reasons to keep going, even when there's no rational justification for hope. So they end up in this middle territory, this no man's land, between all the available positions, all the ready-made identities, all the off-the-shelf worldviews. They become what you might call radical moderates, people who see the partial truth in multiple contradictory perspectives and the limitations in all of them. They're conservative in their respect for tradition and structure and the accumulated wisdom of the past, but radical in their willingness to question and deconstruct and reimagine those very same traditions and structures. They're individualists in their commitment to thinking for themselves and trusting their own experience, but collectivists in their recognition that the self is fundamentally interdependent, that consciousness is not a private possession, but a shared field in which all beings participate. They're mystics in their intuition of something vast and ineffable beyond the reach of concepts, but rationalists in their commitment to clarity and coherence and intellectual rigor. This position of radical moderation, of refusing to collapse into any extreme, is perhaps the most difficult position to maintain in a polarized world that constantly demands you choose a side, declare your allegiance, commit to a program. And so the deep thinker often finds themselves alone, not because they want to be alone, not because they're antisocial or misanthropic, but because finding others who can inhabit this middle territory with them is genuinely difficult. Most people need certainty more than they need truth. Most people need belonging more than they need understanding. Most people need their beliefs confirmed more than they need their assumptions challenged. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's a perfectly natural and understandable human need. But it means that the person who's more interested in truth than certainty, more interested in understanding than belonging, more interested in wisdom than belief, is going to find themselves swimming against the current, walking a path that few others are walking, speaking a language that few others speak. The loneliness of the deep thinker is not the loneliness of being unloved or unwanted. Many deep thinkers have perfectly good relationships, loving families, caring friends. It's a more subtle kind of loneliness, an existential loneliness, the loneliness of being fundamentally misunderstood, even by those closest to you. It's the loneliness of knowing that when you try to share your deepest insights, your most profound realizations, your most cherished understandings, the words will inevitably fall short, will be misheard or misinterpreted or dismissed as intellectual abstraction. It's the loneliness of having experiences that can't be adequately communicated, of seeing patterns that others don't see, of being sensitive to dimensions of reality that most people either can't perceive or don't want to acknowledge. It's the loneliness of the person who's learned a different language but still has to live in a world where everyone else is speaking the old language and translation is always imperfect, always lossy, always leaving out something essential. But here's the paradox that saves this from being merely tragic. The deeper you go into this experience of outsiderness, The more you investigate the nature of this loneliness, the more you begin to recognize that what you're really experiencing is not separation, but intimacy. You're not actually apart from life. You're just seeing life from a different angle, a more inclusive angle, an angle that reveals the interconnectedness of all things rather than their apparent separation. The sense of being an outsider is itself a form of being deeply inside, of being so intimately connected with the totality of existence that you can't be contained by any partial perspective, any limited identity, any particular role or category. You're not alienated from life, you're alienated from the story of yourself as a separate entity, and that alienation opens you to a more direct, unmediated contact with what actually is, stripped of the narrative overlay that usually distances us from immediate experience. This is why many contemplative traditions speak of the path as a process of increasing solitude that paradoxically leads to universal connection. The Buddha sitting alone under the Bodhi tree, the hermits in their desert caves, the monks in their mountain monasteries. They're not running away from life or rejecting the world. They're going deep into their own consciousness, confronting their own mind, seeing through the illusion of separation, and discovering that at the very core of their being, there is no separate being, just being itself, just consciousness itself, just this vast field of awareness that contains all possible experiences without being limited to any particular experience. And when you touch that, even briefly, even imperfectly, you realize that you've never actually been alone, that the loneliness you felt was the loneliness of thinking you were a separate self, when in fact you're an expression of the whole cosmos, a localized intensification of the universal consciousness that permeates all existence. So the deep thinker's journey is a strange one, a path that leads away from the crowd and towards solitude, but then through solitude and back to a new kind of connection with everything. It's a spiral rather than a straight line, moving outward into increasing abstraction and inward into increasing concreteness, moving away from conventional reality and toward a more fundamental reality, moving beyond the personal self and into the transpersonal self that includes and transcends the personal. And at each turn of the spiral, the sense of outsiderness persists, but its meaning changes, its quality shifts, its purpose becomes clearer. What began as an affliction becomes a gift. What felt like exile becomes chosen solitude. What seemed like alienation reveals itself as awakening. Now let's be very clear about something that's easy to romanticize. This awakening, this shift in perspective, doesn't solve your life. It doesn't pay your rent, or heal your relationships, or cure your depression, or make you successful in any worldly sense. If anything, it complicates things, adds another layer of complexity to an already complex existence. Because now, you have to navigate not just the challenges of being human, which are already considerable, but also the challenge of being a human who knows they're not what they appear to be, who's seen behind the curtain of selfhood and can't unsee what they've seen. You're like someone who's learned how a magic trick works, but still has to sit through the performance, still has to watch the magician go through all the motions, still has to participate in the collective pretense that something impossible is happening, even though you know exactly how it's done. This knowledge, this seeing through, creates a peculiar kind of burden. You become responsible, in a sense, for knowing what you know. You can't plead ignorance anymore, can't fall back into unconscious participation in the consensus reality with the same innocent abandon that children or the unquestioning masses can maintain. You're like Adam and Eve after eating from the tree of knowledge. Yes, your eyes have been opened. Yes, you've gained understanding, but you've also lost something precious in the process, a kind of unself-conscious immediacy, a capacity for total absorption in the present moment without the interference of meta-awareness. The price of wisdom is a certain kind of exile from the garden, a loss of innocence that can never be fully recovered, only transcended through an even deeper understanding that includes and redeems the loss. And the thing is, most people don't want this understanding. They're perfectly happy in the garden, or at least they're adapted to life in the garden, and they don't appreciate it when someone comes along pointing out that the whole thing is a construct, that the boundaries are arbitrary, that the story we're all living inside of is just one possible story among infinite others. This is why philosophers have been mocked and marginalized throughout history, why mystics are often treated with suspicion or contempt, why anyone who questions the fundamental assumptions of their culture is likely to be seen as dangerous or crazy or both. The deep thinker threatens the stability of the consensus reality, not by doing anything particularly radical or revolutionary, but simply by existing, by being a living reminder that there are other ways of seeing, other ways of being, other ways of organizing consciousness than the dominant mode that everyone else has agreed to treat as natural and inevitable. This puts the deep thinker in an ethical bind. On one hand, they've seen something that seems important, something that might actually help people suffer less, understand themselves better, live more authentically. The insight that the self is not what we think it is, that our suffering is largely created by our attachment to this fictional self, that freedom is possible through a shift in perspective rather than through changing external circumstances. This seems like genuinely valuable information, worth sharing, worth communicating. But on the other hand, you can't force people to question their assumptions, can't make them see what they're not ready to see, can't wake them up from a dream they're not ready to wake up from. And any attempt to do so just makes you look like a proselytizer, or a cult leader, or an arrogant know-it-all who thinks they've figured out the secrets of existence while everyone else is stumbling around in ignorance. So the deep thinker learns to be quiet, learns to pick their moments, learns to speak in hints and suggestions rather than direct statements. They develop what you might call a pedagogy of indirection, a way of pointing toward the truth without insisting on it, a way of planting seeds without demanding that they grow according to any particular timeline or in any particular direction. They become subtle, strategic, patient in their communication, knowing that real understanding can't be transmitted like information, can't be downloaded like a software update, but has to be discovered by each person in their own way and in their own time. This requires a certain humility, a recognition that you don't actually have the answers for anyone else, that the best you can do is share your own experience and trust that those who resonate with it will find their own path to similar insights. But this strategic silence, this disciplined restraint, also has its costs. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from carrying around insights you can't share, from seeing patterns you can't point out, from understanding dynamics you can't explain, because the explanation would require too much context, too much background, too much willingness to question basic assumptions that your conversation partner isn't ready to question. It's like being a time traveler from the future who knows what's going to happen, but can't convince anyone to take precautions because the very framework they'd need to understand your warning doesn't exist yet in their present moment. You watch people making what you can see are obvious mistakes, heading toward what you can see are obvious disasters, operating under what you can see are obvious misconceptions, and you can't do much about it except perhaps offer gentle suggestions that are usually ignored or misunderstood. This is where the deep thinker can fall into one of several traps. One trap is superiority, the temptation to start thinking of yourself as more evolved or more enlightened or more aware than the masses of unthinking humanity. This is a particularly seductive trap because it offers a kind of consolation for your outsider status. Yes, you're lonely. Yes, you're misunderstood. But that's because you're special, because you see what others can't see, because you're operating at a higher level of consciousness. The problem with this trap is that it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what you've actually discovered. You haven't discovered that you're better than other people. You've discovered that the whole concept of you is questionable, that the separate self you'd need to be in order to be superior to others is precisely what you've seen through. The recognition of no self cuts both ways. It means you can't claim any special status or achievement because there's no one there to claim it. The moment you start thinking you're enlightened is the moment you've lost the plot, because enlightenment, if it means anything, means seeing through the illusion of a separate entity who could be enlightened. Another trap is nihilism, the conclusion that if the self is an illusion and meaning is constructed and nothing has any ultimate foundation, then nothing matters, and there's no point in trying or caring or engaging with life at all. This trap is equally seductive because it offers a different kind of consolation, The consolation of checking out, of not having to participate in the game anymore, of retreating into a kind of philosophical depression, where your lack of engagement with life can be justified as a rational response to the absurdity of existence. But this too is a misunderstanding, a way of using insight as an excuse for avoidance rather than as a doorway to deeper engagement. Yes, the self is empty, but the emptiness is not nothing. It's the space in which everything arises. Yes, meaning is constructed, but that doesn't make it arbitrary or valueless. It makes it creative, participatory, something we're actively involved in generating rather than something imposed on us from outside. Yes, nothing has ultimate foundation, but that groundlessness is precisely what makes freedom possible, what allows for genuine spontaneity and novelty and surprise. The middle way between these traps is to recognize that the insight into no self or emptiness or the constructed nature of reality is not an endpoint but a beginning, not a conclusion but an opening. It's the clearing away of false certainties that makes genuine inquiry possible. It's the recognition that you don't know what you are that allows you to discover what you actually are. It's the surrender of the need to be someone special that opens you to the genuine specialness of being anything at all, of being this particular expression of consciousness in this particular moment with these particular circumstances. And from this place of not knowing, of genuine openness to what is, a different kind of relationship to life becomes possible. Not the relationship of the separate self, trying to get what it wants and avoid what it doesn't want, but the relationship of conscious participation in the unfolding of existence itself. This is where the deep thinker's outsiderness transforms from a problem into a practice, from an affliction into an art. You learn to inhabit the edge, to dwell in the liminal space, to be comfortable with paradox and ambiguity and uncertainty. You learn that you don't need to resolve the contradiction between being wave and ocean, form and emptiness, relative and absolute. You can be all of these simultaneously, shifting between perspectives as the situation requires, holding the whole mandala of existence in your awareness without collapsing it into any single view. You learn that the feeling of being an outsider in your own life is not something wrong with you, but something fundamentally right with you, a sign that you haven't been completely hypnotized by the cultural trance, that you've maintained some capacity for independent seeing, for original perception, for direct contact with reality as it actually is, rather than as we've been told it should be. And you learn, perhaps most importantly, that this path you're walking is not a path away from ordinary life, but a path deeper into ordinary life, not a transcendence of the human condition, but a fuller acceptance of it. The goal is not to escape the game, but to play it with full awareness, not to be above it all, but to be fully in it while knowing you're in it. This is what the Zen masters mean when they talk about ordinary mind being the way, what Lao Tzu means when he says the sage wears coarse cloth while carrying jade in his breast, what Rumi means when he says, let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It's about bringing the full depth of your understanding to bear on the simple, immediate, concrete tasks of being human. Eating when you're hungry, sleeping when you're tired, responding with compassion to suffering, celebrating beauty when you encounter it, doing your work with integrity, treating others with kindness, living with awareness and attention and care. But let's not pretend this is easy, or that there's some final arrival point where everything makes sense and all the tension resolves. The deep thinker's path is not a ladder you climb to some summit of permanent enlightenment. It's more like learning to surf, learning to ride waves that are constantly changing, constantly requiring you to adjust your balance, constantly threatening to knock you off your board. You have good days and bad days, moments of clarity and periods of confusion, times when the insight is bright and alive, and times when it fades into the background and you're just muddling through like everyone else. The difference is that once you've tasted a different way of being, once you've experienced even briefly what it's like to live without the constant weight of self-concern, you can't completely forget it. It becomes a reference point, a touchstone, something you can return to even when you've wandered far away from it. What happens over time, and this is something that can only be understood through living it, not through thinking about it, is that the oscillation between these different states, between self-consciousness and unself-consciousness, between feeling like an outsider and feeling connected, between conceptual understanding and direct experience, begins to smooth out. It's not that the poles disappear or that you transcend the duality permanently, but rather that you become more fluid in your movement between them, more skillful in navigating the terrain, more accepting of the fact that this is just how consciousness works when it becomes aware of itself. You stop trying to fix yourself, stop trying to achieve some permanent state of awakening, stop trying to become someone other than who you are. Instead, you start to work with what's actually here, with the particular configuration of consciousness you've been given, with the specific challenges and gifts that come with being the kind of person who can't help but reflect on their own experience. And here's something strange that happens. As you become more accepting of your outsiderness, more comfortable with not fitting in, more at ease with being the person who always has one foot outside the door, you actually become more present, more engaged, more genuinely connected with others than you were when you were trying so hard to belong. It's as if the effort to fit in was what was creating the distance, and once you stop trying to be something you're not, once you accept that you're always going to be a little bit different, a little bit apart, a little bit weird from the perspective of conventional society, you can relax and just be whoever you actually are. And paradoxically, this authenticity, this willingness to be strange, often attracts exactly the people who can meet you where you are, who appreciate you for your strangeness rather than despite it, who are drawn to the very qualities that made you feel like an outsider in the first place. The deep thinker begins to discover their tribe, not in any geographical location or social group, but scattered throughout the culture, hiding in plain sight, often doing perfectly ordinary jobs and living perfectly ordinary lives, but carrying inside them the same questions, the same awareness, the same sense of participating in something larger than their individual existence. These are the people who light up when you mention certain ideas, who don't look at you like you're crazy when you try to articulate some subtle experience of consciousness, who understand immediately what you're pointing at when you use language in slightly unusual ways to gesture toward realities that ordinary language wasn't designed to capture. These meetings are rare, but when they happen, they're profound. You feel seen, understood, recognized in a way that's qualitatively different from ordinary social recognition. It's not about sharing interests or hobbies or demographic categories. It's about sharing a certain quality of awareness, a certain orientation toward existence, a certain commitment to looking at what's actually true rather than what's comfortable or convenient to believe. These connections matter enormously, not because they solve the problem of loneliness, the existential loneliness remains, it's part of the territory, but because they confirm that you're not crazy, that what you've seen is actually there to be seen, that other people have made similar journeys and arrived at similar places. This confirmation doesn't come from agreement or consensus or groupthink, but from a deeper recognition, a kind of wordless understanding that happens when two people who've both seen through the same illusions meet each other's eyes, and something passes between them that doesn't need to be articulated. It's the recognition that Ramana Maharshi spoke of when he said that silence is the true teaching, that the Guru's presence communicates more than words ever could, that the transmission of understanding happens not through concepts, but through a kind of vibrational resonance, consciousness recognizing itself in another form. But even with these rare connections, even with the occasional meeting of minds that confirms you're not alone in your particular way of being alone, the deep thinker still has to live their life, still has to navigate the ordinary world with all its demands and expectations and misunderstandings. And this is where a certain kind of humor becomes essential, a cosmic humor, a divine comedy, the ability to see the whole situation, your life, the human condition, the universe itself, as simultaneously tragic and hilarious, profound and absurd, desperately important and utterly meaningless. This humor is not cynicism or mockery or defensive irony. It's something more fundamental, a recognition of the playful nature of existence itself, the way that consciousness seems to be engaged in an elaborate game with itself for no particular reason other than the sheer joy of playing. You start to see your own struggles, your own dramas, your own existential crises as part of this cosmic play, no more or less significant than anything else that's happening in the universe. Yes, your experience of outsiderness is real, your loneliness is real, your confusion is real, but it's also no more real than a character in a dream is real, a wave in the ocean is real, a cloud formation is real. It's a temporary pattern, a fleeting arrangement, a particular way that consciousness has organized itself in this moment. And seeing this doesn't diminish the experience. If anything, it intensifies it, makes it more vivid, more precious, more beautiful in its impermanence. You stop taking yourself so seriously, while simultaneously taking your experience more seriously. Stop worrying so much about being someone while becoming more genuinely who you are. Stop trying to figure it all out, while understanding more deeply than ever before. This is the strange alchemy of the deep thinker's journey. The more you understand about the illusory nature of the self, the more freely and fully you can be yourself. The more you recognize that meaning is constructed, the more meaningfully you can engage with life. The more you see through the game, the more wholeheartedly you can play it. It's as if the insight strips away all the false motivations, all the ego-driven agendas, all the desperate grasping and avoiding, and what's left is a kind of pure spontaneity, a natural responsiveness, an effortless action that flows from your deepest nature, without any interference from the self-conscious mind that used to run the show. You're still making choices, still navigating challenges, still encountering problems and finding solutions, but the quality of it is different, lighter, freer, more spacious, more allowing, more accepting of whatever arises. The deep thinker who reaches this stage, and it's not really a stage but a continually deepening process, a spiral that keeps circling back to the same insights at different levels of understanding, discovers something remarkable. That the outsiderness they've been living with all along was actually preparation for a different kind of insiderness, a more fundamental belonging, a connection with existence that doesn't depend on social acceptance or cultural validation or any external confirmation whatsoever. They discover that they belong to life itself, to consciousness itself, to the mystery itself, and that this belonging can never be lost because it's not based on any condition or quality or achievement. It's based on the simple fact of being, on the undeniable reality that existence is happening and you're part of it, not as a separate entity, but as one of the infinite ways that existence experiences itself. This doesn't mean the feeling of being an outsider goes away. If anything, as we've said, it becomes more refined, more pronounced, more continuously present. But its emotional charge changes. What was once experienced as painful alienation becomes something more like wonder, curiosity, fascination with the sheer improbability and mystery of being conscious at all. You're still observing your life from a slight distance, still maintaining that witness position, but now you recognize that the witness is not separate from what's witnessed, that the observer and the observed are two sides of the same coin, two aspects of a single process that's neither purely subjective nor purely objective, but something that includes and transcends both. Let's explore something that's often overlooked in discussions of consciousness and self-awareness. The sheer physical exhaustion of being a deep thinker, the embodied dimension of this experience of outsiderness. Because it's not just a mental or philosophical or spiritual condition, it's also a somatic reality, something that lives in your body, that affects your nervous system, that shapes your relationship to physical existence. The deep thinker's body often carries a particular kind of tension, a holding pattern that reflects the psychological stance of observation, the subtle contraction that comes from always maintaining that observer position. There's a tightness in the shoulders, a constriction in the breath, a quality of not quite inhabiting your full physical presence because so much of your attention is directed inward, toward the endless stream of thoughts and meta-thoughts and thoughts about thoughts. This is why so many wisdom traditions emphasize embodiment practices, yoga, tai chi, meditation, breathing exercises, martial arts, because they've recognized that you can't just think your way out of the prison of excessive self-consciousness. You have to feel your way out, breathe your way out, move your way out. You have to bring awareness back down from the head into the whole body. Have to learn to be present, not just as a thinking consciousness, but as a breathing, sensing, feeling organism, embedded in a physical world. The deep thinker often resists this, sees it as somehow beneath them, as if the body were a crude machine that merely houses the noble mind. But this is another trap, another form of the dualism that creates suffering, another way of being split from yourself. The real integration, the genuine healing of the sense of outsiderness, has to include the body. You have to learn to feel your feet on the ground, to sense the weight of your skeleton, to track the subtle sensations that are always flowing through your organism, to notice how emotions live in your gut and your chest and your throat, not just in your thoughts about emotions. You have to discover what the Buddhists call the body as a field of awareness, what phenomenologists call the lived body as opposed to the body as object, what somatic therapists call embodied presence. This is not easy for the intellectual type, for the person who's spent years cultivating their conceptual abilities at the expense of their sensory abilities. It requires a different kind of attention, a different kind of intelligence, a willingness to not know in a more radical way than even the philosophical not knowing we've been discussing. Because when you really drop into your body, when you really allow yourself to feel what's actually present in this moment without the mediation of thought, something quite extraordinary happens. The observer disappears. Not permanently, not completely, but temporarily. For moments at a time, you find yourself just sensing, just feeling, just breathing, without anyone doing the sensing, or feeling, or breathing. There's just the raw presence of experience, the immediacy of being alive in a body, the simple fact of sensation arising and passing away. And in these moments, the whole problem of outsiderness dissolves, because there's no inside and outside, no self and world, just this seamless field of experiencing that doesn't need any commentary or interpretation or understanding. This is what the mystics mean when they talk about losing yourself, about self-forgetting, about dying before you die. They're not talking about some grandiose spiritual achievement or supernatural experience. They're talking about these simple moments of being so fully present that the self-conscious observer temporarily drops away, and there's just presence without anyone being present. And here's the miracle. These moments are available all the time in the most ordinary activities: washing dishes, walking down the street, feeling the sun on your skin, listening to music, eating a piece of fruit. Anytime you can bring your full attention to the sensory dimension of experience without trying to think about it or interpret it or make sense of it, you're tasting this more fundamental way of being, this mode of consciousness that precedes and underlies the self-reflective mode that the deep thinker is so familiar with. So there's a dimension of the journey that moves not through more thinking, more analysis, more understanding, but through less thinking, more sensing, more direct contact with what the Zen people call suchness, the way things are in their immediate presence, before we overlay them with concepts and judgments and stories. This doesn't mean abandoning thought or trying to permanently shut off the conceptual mind. That would be another form of violence, another rejection of part of your experience. It means recognizing that thought is one mode of consciousness among many, and that the deep thinker has often become overdeveloped in this one mode at the expense of other modes that are equally valid and valuable. It means learning to shift fluidly between different kinds of awareness, conceptual and sensory, analytical and intuitive, focused and diffuse, doing and being. The deep thinker who learns this begins to live in a different way, begins to move through their days with a different quality of presence. They're still thinking, still analyzing, still maintaining that capacity for meta-awareness that's so characteristic of their type, but it's not running constantly anymore, not dominating every moment of experience. They've learned to turn it on when it's useful and let it rest when it's not, have developed what you might call cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between modes rather than being stuck in one mode all the time. This is actually a sign of psychological health, this capacity to be appropriate to context, to bring the right kind of consciousness to the right kind of situation, rather than approaching everything with the same analytical lens. And something else happens as you develop this flexibility. The sense of outsiderness becomes less fixed, less permanent, less like a character trait, and more like weather passing through. Sometimes you're identified with the observer position. Sometimes you're merged with experience, Sometimes you're somewhere in between. Sometimes the separation is sharp and painful. Sometimes it's soft and spacious. Sometimes it dissolves altogether for periods of time. You stop thinking of it as a problem that needs to be solved and start experiencing it as a kind of breathing, a natural rhythm of consciousness expanding and contracting, differentiating and integrating, moving out and moving in. You're learning to dance with it rather than fight against it, to ride it rather than be pushed around by it, to work with the grain of your particular consciousness rather than against it. This brings us to something crucial. The deep thinker's gift to the world is not their analysis or their insights or their clever observations about the nature of reality, valuable as those may be. Their real gift is their presence, the quality of awareness they bring to whatever situation they're in, the way they can hold space for complexity and paradox and mystery without trying to resolve everything into simple answers. In a culture that's increasingly polarized, increasingly driven by certainty and conviction, and the need to be right, the deep thinker offers something different, a willingness to not know, to hold questions open, to resist premature closure, to sit with ambiguity and uncertainty, and the discomfort of having multiple truths exist simultaneously. This is not a popular gift. As we've discussed, people mostly want certainty, want answers, want to be told that their way of seeing things is correct and everyone else is wrong. But it's a needed gift, perhaps now more than ever, because the problems we're facing collectively, ecological, political, technological, existential, are too complex to be solved by any single perspective, any single ideology, any single way of knowing. We need people who can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, who can see the validity in different viewpoints even when they contradict each other, who can navigate complexity without either oversimplifying it or being paralyzed by it. And this is what the deep thinker has trained for, often without realizing they were training for anything, through all those years of feeling like an outsider, of not fitting in, of questioning everything, of refusing to settle into comfortable certainty. So perhaps the deep thinker's sense of outsiderness is not a bug, but a feature, not a problem, but a position, not something to be overcome, but something to be inhabited more fully, more consciously, more skillfully. Perhaps the very qualities that made you feel alienated from mainstream culture, your tendency to question, to reflect, to see through surfaces, to notice patterns that others miss, to feel the suffering of existence more acutely, to be sensitive to dimensions of reality that are usually ignored. Perhaps these are exactly what the world needs, what your particular corner of the world is calling for, what you're here to offer, even if no one explicitly asked for it, and even if you're never fully appreciated for it. And so we come full circle, back to where we began, but seeing it now from a different angle, with a different quality of understanding. The deep thinker's feeling of being an outsider in their own life is not something that can be fixed or resolved or transcended in any final way. It's woven into the very fabric of a certain kind of consciousness, a consciousness that has developed the capacity to observe itself, to reflect on its own experience, to maintain what we might call a meta-perspective on whatever's happening. This capacity is both gift and burden, both liberation and exile, both the source of profound insight and the root of existential loneliness. And the question is not how to get rid of it. You can't, not without lobotomizing yourself, not without shutting down the very faculty that makes you who you are, but how to live with it skillfully, how to work with it creatively, how to transform what feels like a curse into something more like a calling. The transformation happens not through adding something new, but through subtracting something old, specifically through subtracting the story that something is wrong with you, that you're broken or defective or failing at being human because you don't experience life the way most people seem to experience it. This story of wrongness is what creates the suffering, not the outsiderness itself. The outsiderness is just what's happening, just the way your consciousness is organized, just the particular flavor of your being in the world. But when you tell yourself that this way of being is a problem, when you judge it as inadequate or inferior or pathological, then you're creating a second layer of suffering on top of the first layer, a kind of suffering about suffering, a meta-suffering that compounds the difficulty exponentially. What if you dropped that story? What if you simply allowed yourself to be exactly as you are, with all the strangeness and sensitivity and self-consciousness that characterizes your particular way of being? What if you stopped trying to fit yourself into templates designed for people who are wired differently? Stopped comparing yourself to some imaginary normal person who doesn't actually exist? Stopped apologizing for seeing what you see and feeling what you feel? What if you trusted that your way of experiencing life is valid, legitimate, worthwhile, even valuable, not despite its differences, but because of them? What if you recognized that the universe, or consciousness, or God, or whatever you want to call the mystery that's generating all of this, has created an infinite diversity of ways of being aware, and yours is one of them, no better or worse than any other, just different, just yours? This acceptance is not resignation or defeat or giving up on growth and change. It's something more radical. It's the recognition that you can't grow authentically from a foundation of self-rejection. That real transformation only becomes possible when you stop trying to be something other than what you are. It's the understanding that the deepest healing happens not through fixing yourself, but through seeing through the illusion that you were ever broken in the first place. Yes, you can learn new skills, develop new capacities, integrate shadow material, work through trauma, all of that. But the foundation has to be acceptance, has to be a basic friendliness toward your own experience, has to be what the Buddhists call maitri or loving kindness toward yourself as you actually are, not as you think you should be. And when that acceptance settles in, when you stop fighting against your own nature, something remarkable happens. The outsiderness remains, but it becomes lighter, more spacious, less problematic. You're still observing your life from that slight distance, still maintaining that witness consciousness, still experiencing that sense of being slightly apart from the stream of ordinary existence. But now you're doing it with awareness, with choice, with a kind of playful curiosity, rather than anxious self-consciousness. You're like an actor who's fully in character, but also knows they're acting, who's giving their full presence to the role while never completely forgetting that it's a role. This is what's meant by being in the world, but not of it. You're participating fully while maintaining your freedom from total identification with any particular role or identity or position. The deep thinker, at their best, becomes what we might call a conscious amateur of existence, an amateur in the original sense of the word, from the Latin amator, one who loves. They're not professionals at life, not experts, not masters who figured it all out. They're lovers of the mystery, devotees of the question, people who are endlessly fascinated by the simple fact that anything exists at all, that consciousness happens, that awareness is aware. And this amateur quality, this quality of perpetual beginner's mind, is what keeps their perception fresh, their curiosity alive, their capacity for wonder intact, even as they grow older and accumulate experience and develop understanding. Because here's the final paradox, the ultimate koan of the deep thinker's journey. The more deeply you understand the nature of consciousness and self and reality, the more mysterious it all becomes. You don't end up with answers, you end up with better questions. You don't arrive at certainty, you arrive at a more sophisticated uncertainty, a more refined not knowing, a more comfortable relationship with the groundlessness of existence. You become like Socrates, claiming to know only that he knows nothing, but carrying that knowing nothing with grace and humor and a kind of wisdom that's more valuable than any amount of factual knowledge could ever be. This wisdom is not something you can put in a book or teach in a course or transmit through words. It's more like a perfume that emanates from people who've walked this path, a quality of presence that others can sense even if they can't articulate what they're sensing. It shows up in the way you listen, really listen, without immediately jumping to judgment or interpretation. It shows up in the way you can hold space for someone else's pain or confusion without trying to fix it or explain it away. It shows up in your capacity to be present with whatever's happening without needing it to be different, without grasping at pleasure or pushing away pain, without constructing elaborate stories about what it all means. It shows up in your humor, your lightness, your ability to take the world seriously without taking yourself too seriously. And perhaps most importantly, this wisdom shows up in your capacity to be ordinary, to be simple, to be just this person in this moment, doing this thing without any need for it to be special or significant or part of some grand narrative of spiritual achievement. The deep thinker who's really gone deep eventually comes back to the surface, back to the ordinary world of shopping and cooking and working and loving and all the mundane details of daily life. But they come back transformed, not in any dramatic or obvious way, but in a subtle shift of presence, a quality of being that's more relaxed, more natural, more authentic, more human. They've learned that enlightenment, if it exists at all, is not about transcending the human condition, but about embracing it fully, about being completely, unabashedly, unreservedly human, without apology or pretension. So the deep thinker's journey is ultimately a journey home, but not home to any place they've been before. It's home to a recognition that's always been true, but rarely noticed, that you are the awareness in which all experience arises, that you are both the wave and the ocean, that you are simultaneously nobody special and the entire universe expressing itself through this particular form. And the feeling of being an outsider, which has accompanied you throughout this journey, reveals itself finally as a kind of compassionate distance, a space of awareness that allows you to witness the human drama, including your own participation in it, with a mixture of involvement and detachment, care and non-attachment, love and freedom. You're still the person who doesn't quite fit in, who sees things others don't see, who asks questions others don't ask, who experiences life with a kind of meta-awareness that most people don't cultivate. But now you understand that this is your medicine, your gift, your particular way of serving the evolution of consciousness. You're a scout, a pioneer, an explorer of inner space, mapping territories of awareness that the mainstream culture hasn't yet recognized or valued. And maybe that map will be useful to others someday. Maybe it won't. Maybe you'll find ways to communicate what you've discovered. Maybe you'll carry it silently. Maybe you'll create things that embody this understanding. Art, writing, ways of being with people. Or maybe you'll simply live it quietly in your own corner of the world, influencing only those you directly encounter. Either way, you're no longer suffering from your outsiderness. You're living from it, living through it, allowing it to be the window through which consciousness looks at itself, the aperture through which light enters the world. You've become what you always were but couldn't quite recognize. Not an outsider at all, but an insider into a deeper dimension of existence, someone who's found their way to the center by going all the way to the edge. And from that edge, that boundary between the known and unknown, the manifest and unmanifest, the self and no self, you can see something that's invisible from the center of the conventional world. That the whole thing is a play, a dance, a cosmic joke, a serious game that consciousness is playing with itself for the sheer delight of seeing what happens when it forgets what it is and then remembers again. You're home finally, but home is not a place or a state or an achievement. Home is this, right here, right now, exactly as it is, with all the confusion and clarity, all the loneliness and connection, all the suffering and joy, all the questions and no answers that make up the texture of a conscious life. Home is being who you are, which includes being someone who doesn't quite know who they are, who feels like an outsider, who watches their own life with puzzlement and wonder and a kind of affectionate bemusement at the whole improbable situation. Home is right where you've always been, even when you were most convinced you were lost. And the journey was never about arriving somewhere else. It was about recognizing what was already true, always true, true before you were born and true after you die, true in every moment, whether you notice it or not. That consciousness is, that awareness happens, that existence exists, and that you are that, not in addition to being yourself, but as the very ground and essence of what yourself actually is. Welcome home, deep thinker. Welcome to the beginning, which is also the end, which is also the eternal middle, where everything always is. Welcome to your life, to your outsiderness, to your gift, to your burden, to your calling. Welcome to the mystery you'll never solve, the question you'll never answer, the paradox you'll never resolve. Welcome to being exactly who you are, which is exactly what the universe needs you to be, whether you know it or not, whether anyone else knows it or not, whether it makes any sense or not. Just this. Always only this. Forever this. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.